Hey guys, I hope everybody had a good week this week. Hope you got to do some fun things, even though we're kind of on a lockdown now. I wanted to let you know that we had to make the official call last week about Cook Springs and we canceled our retreat. I do have some good news though. We are booked to go to Cook Springs November the 13th through the 15th. So this year, Cook Springs will be a fall retreat. I'm already excited about it and what God will have in store for us. I hope you'll mark your calendars and make plans to be there. I do want to let you know that this Sunday, we as a church are going to be celebrating the Lord's Supper together and having communion in our homes. And out front in the pull-through of the church, we've got a box with small prepackaged communion cups. It's a little thing of juice and a cracker that you can come by and get for you and for your family, while supplies last, of course. But we're going to do that this Sunday morning as Brother Mike preaches his Sunday morning service. I plan on putting together some videos of some of the fun things that you guys have been doing during this coronavirus outbreak and having to stay at home. So text me pictures of the fun stuff that you and your family have been up to. I'm going to put that together and have it on YouTube for everybody to take a look and keep up with each other. I'm already working on that for our college students who have been away at school. They're sending me pictures from their fall semesters. I want you guys to send me some pictures of what's been going on since you've been out of school on this very extended spring break. I hope that you had a chance to read through Matthew chapters 5 through 7 again this week. If you haven't done that, I'm encouraging everybody to read through that once a week. It's only 3 chapters. It's not that much, but there's so much in there that Jesus shared in the Sermon on the Mount that's so worth reading. And every time I read through it, something new pops up and comes to mind. So this week, we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 through verse 20. So I've enlisted some help to read these scriptures for me this week. So let's send it over to Wyatt first.
Matthew 5:17. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them.
Thanks, Wyatt. There's no doubt you're the son of Shane Miss Kelly. Let's kick it over to Jonathan. Jonathan, share with us the next scripture, verse 18.
I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Matthew 5:18.
Trey agreed to help us with verse 19. So Trey, go ahead.
Matthew 5:19. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commandments and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commandments will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Go.
Thanks, Trey. Appreciate that, man. All right. Ashley Hall is going to read the next verse for us.
Matthew 5:20 says, For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven.
Thanks, Ashley. I appreciate you reading that for us. Thanks to everybody who helped out this week. I'm going to be asking some more people to help out in the weeks ahead, so be ready for that text. You know, it seems like as we look at Jesus' life that he was always in an argument with the Pharisees and the scribes because of the laws that they had in place. And so for Jesus here to be talking about the law with a reverence that not even the Pharisees could match, we have to ask ourselves, okay, so what is Jesus talking about when he says that this law is not to be broken? In Romans 10:4, Paul tells us that Christ was actually the culmination of the law. So he gives us a hint into what Jesus is really meaning by this, but let's take a look at it. Again and again, Jesus broke what they called the law. He would heal people on the Sabbath day. Don't forget, he was crucified as a lawbreaker. So what exactly does he mean? Since he said in verse 17 that he hadn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, we have to ask ourselves the question, what exactly is Jesus talking about in the law? Back in Jesus' day, when the Jewish people heard the law, it could mean really one of 4 things. First, it could be the actual 10 commandments that God gave to Moses on Mount Sinai. Thou shalt not. That's one way that they considered that phrase, the law, to be talking about. Second, it could be talking about the first 5 books of the Bible. Moses' 5 books that he wrote, what they often call the Pentateuch. That could be what they were talking about when he said the law. There's a third thing. The law could actually be referring to the whole of the Old Testament that we know today, all of the writings of the prophets. Could be talking about those books. But fourth, It could be talking about the oral and scribal traditions. And that's what Jesus is actually addressing here. You see, the Ten Commandments laid out these broad principles that we could follow as followers of God. But in all honesty, who can say that they could keep all of the Ten Commandments? None of us could, because that standard is just way too high. So what happened was, within the Jewish people, a group of people called the scribes arose who started writing out really particular things, trying to further define what the law actually was. They got down to saying, okay, so let's take the Sabbath, for instance, that we're supposed to keep a Sabbath day. We're not supposed to work on a Sabbath day. Okay, so they had to define, well, what exactly does work constitute? What is work? They broke it down as detailed to say that on the Sabbath day, a parent couldn't even pick up a child because that would be considered work. Or you couldn't lift a pen up to write more than 2 letters of the alphabet, or that would be considered work. They had some crazy stuff. If somebody was injured, you could apply a bandage to the injury, but you couldn't do anything to make it better. So it'd be like your mom saying, okay, I know that could get infected, but I can't put Neosporin on it today because it's Sunday, so I'm just going to put a plain Band-Aid, and then tomorrow we'll try to help it get better. Their laws were just crazy, but here's what they did. Here's at the heart of what they were trying to do. They were trying to turn the law into something that in their own human ability they could accomplish. You see, by making things that specific and detailed, yeah, it's very cumbersome, but within human power, those are all things that you could do. The thing about the law that God gave us in the Ten Commandments is that we're fully dependent upon Him to be able to keep the law. There's no way in our human power we could always keep the commandments and not break the law. We're all sinners and we know it. But what the scribes did was they tried to break this down so detailed in a way that they could actually manage it. And there was this other group of people called the Pharisees who had committed to trying to actually do it. They separated themselves out from the rest of society, and they're the ones who tried to keep all these minute and detailed laws. And that law had just become crazy. It'd be impossible to keep up with. I don't know if you've heard about the package that our government is putting together to try to help small businesses get through this very difficult time in our country's history. I've had about 7 emails from my accountant's office, and I'm not even a small business owner, but he's sending it out to everybody because this law and how you can get this assistance is so detailed that they're having to revise it like every day. Think about how cumbersome this law was for just the average Jewish person. To try to keep up with all these things would have been exhausting. What Jesus is saying was that he hasn't come to abolish the law, but that's not the law he's talking about, because you can look all throughout his ministry where he broke their traditional oral law and did things on the Sabbath day. And not only that, he didn't try to follow all of their rules that they had made up, those man-made rules. He was trying to get us to understand that it's an issue of the heart, that if we want to call ourselves followers of Christ, he has to dwell in our hearts. And our desire isn't to follow a specific law. Our desire is to please God by loving him and letting our actions follow out through that. And that's what Jesus is really addressing here. Look at verse 18. It said, "For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished." Not the least stroke of a pen. I don't like to throw Greek around a lot because I know you don't know it. And to be honest with you, I've been out of seminary for 15 years now. I don't remember a whole lot of it. But the smallest letter in the Greek alphabet was called an iode. It was almost like a little dot. And Jesus is referencing that here. It's where we get the phrase, "I don't give an iota." He's saying that not even the smallest letter of the law will fade away, will go away until it's all accomplished. Now, what does that mean? He wasn't there to abolish God's law that he had given through the Ten Commandments. He was there to fulfill it. And that's what the whole Old Testament pointed towards. The whole Old Testament pointed us towards the fact that Jesus was the culmination of God's love for us, of God's law for us, and he was going to fulfill that law. Jesus fulfilled the law by teaching the law. He explained the Old Testament to his disciples several times that we have recorded. He made everything make sense that all the prophets had written about who the Messiah would be. So he fulfilled the law with his teaching. But he also fulfilled the law in other ways. Jesus fulfilled the law because he met the demands of the law. Nobody before Jesus was able to say that. Nobody could have said that in their life they fulfilled the entire law without breaking one single part of it. We know that Jesus was the perfect lamb, the sacrifice for our sins. He was without blemish, which means he never sinned. So he fulfilled the law in a way that he kept the law perfectly. He didn't break one part of it. So Jesus fulfilled the law by teaching us to the full extent what the Old Testament was really talking about, what all the prophets were talking about when they spoke of the Messiah. So he fulfilled the law by teaching it. He fulfilled the law by meeting its demands, for sure. But finally, and I think most importantly, Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament. He fulfilled the law by being the fulfillment of the law. In his own life, he accomplished everything that the law was pointing us towards, which was to know our absolute inability to earn God's love, but to see that God chooses to love us despite our faults. Jesus didn't come just to teach us what righteousness was. He came to be righteousness. And not only was he righteousness by living that perfect life, he turns around and he gives us his righteousness through what Jesus did on the cross with his sacrificial atonement. And what that means is he sacrificed his perfect life to pay for our sins as an atonement for our sins. But he turns around and he gives that righteousness to us as his children. So we can be called children of God, and it can be true because of what Christ accomplished. So Jesus fulfilled the law because he was everything that the law pointed to. He was the perfect sacrifice. He was the perfect high priest. He was everything that the Old Testament symbolically pointed us towards. That's why after Jesus was raised from the dead, any of those sacrifices that still went on in the temple by the Jewish people who missed out on who Jesus was, those sacrifices were for nothing. All those Old Testament sacrifices ever were was a symbol of what would one day happen through the Messiah. So when they sacrificed an animal or burned up a grain offering, those sacrifices never really paid for our sins. They pointed to the one who would one day pay for our sins. So when Jesus fulfilled that on the cross, those sacrifices were no longer necessary. When Jesus tells us in verse 20 that our righteousness would have to exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees, he's wanting us to understand something. You see, their motive was to obey the law to the T, the laws even that they had come up with on their own. Their motive was to obey that law. Jesus wants our motive to be love. And if we're willing to follow him, to live according to love, then that'll be our driving factor in how we can follow the law.